Religion in Tibet, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, is really a center of Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity. And for China to effectively control Tibet, then you really have to destroy that religion, or at least limit it. That is very essential, and the Chinese know this.
Since China's invasion of Tibet in 1949, the Tibetan people have struggled for the right to practice their religion freely. Though the memory of China's violent attacks on Tibetan Buddhism remains, over the last 2 decades, Tibetans have devoted themselves to rebuilding thousands of monasteries, and religious practice has accelerated across the Tibetan plateau. But China's top leaders have expressed deep concern about the continued popularity and rapid growth of Tibetan Buddhism, and a new wave of Communist Party policies to stifle the spread of religion in Tibet leaves the future of Tibetan Buddhism in its homeland uncertain. Today, the Dalai Lama, Tibet's exiled spiritual and temporal leader, remains in India, where he urges for negotiations with the Chinese leadership. And inside Tibet, the struggle for religious freedom continues.
We don't expect that if we shout for religious freedom or human rights in Tibet, that these will be granted straight away. But even if I was beaten, killed, or imprisoned, even if I could only shout a few words, it would help the Tibetan people.
Maybe if our tourists go to Tibet, they will see a monastery, monks chanting, and people are burning their butter lamps, all those things. But this is one level that is these days permit to do that. But Tibetan Buddhism is, I think, it's more than that. It's more than just some kind of a ceremonial thing. You have to study, you have to be trained, and in that level, there's a very little freedom to do these kind of things.
You can wear red, but you can't fully practice. We couldn't invite teachers to our nunnery at all. We couldn't even go to receive teachings elsewhere. We would have to ask permission from the local authorities to go for teachings or to invite lamas. There were a few older nuns, and they taught us to recite and memorize manuscripts. But there wasn't a deep religious knowledge like there used to be.
Tibet's monastic tradition began more than 1,200 years ago. The teachings focused on the Buddha's path to enlightenment through mental discipline and compassion for all living beings. The monasteries developed a sophisticated educational system that required a lifelong commitment to contemplation and study. Monks and nuns trained in Buddhist philosophy, debate, and meditation, as well as mathematics, medicine, literature, and the ritual arts. More than 6,000 monasteries would be constructed across the Tibetan plateau, housing hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns. And as the religious infrastructure grew, so did its political, economic, and social influence on Tibetan society.
These institutions become so large, and their power and their impact is so large that it's difficult in that society to flourish in other ideas and other sort of parts of civil society.
Buddhism shaped the worldview of the vast majority of Tibetans, whose lives were integrally linked with Tibet's religious institutions. But in 1959, Chinese communist aggression drove the 23-year-old Dalai Lama into exile. And Mao Zedong's government began a massive campaign to shut down Tibet's monasteries. virtually all of Tibet's monks and nuns were forcefully disrobed and sent back to their villages, sent to labor camps, imprisoned, or killed. The campaign intensified in 1965 when the communist government told Tibetans that their Buddhist beliefs were superstitious and backward, that they must be abandoned in order to modernize Tibet. Mao's Cultural Revolution had begun.
The monasteries were razed through artillery, shells, and people just tearing the monasteries apart with their bare hands. And there were a lot of Chinese Red Guards that came up from China to do this. But there were also a lot of Tibetans engaged in it. China was successful in creating this zealous group of people willing to tear down a whole society.
Then there are some Tibetans, they thought this is a good thing. This is their advancing their society and their civilization. This is a march toward the modernization, this march toward communism. When you are so overwhelmed by a huge state like China, with such a huge sort of a political movement, with all the ideology, with the bombardment with the propaganda, and without hearing anything else than what the state is saying, and anybody who's sort of counter to these ideas would be just punished by, imprisonment and parade to the street and humiliate you. It's difficult to resist for anybody.
The attacks on Buddhism and the forced abandonment of religious practice devastated the Tibetan people. The Cultural Revolution destroyed all but a handful of the 6,000 monasteries in Tibet. It would take more than a decade and a change of Chinese leadership for Buddhism to resurface from the ruins. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping's reform policies allowed for the limited reinstitution of prayer festivals and the reconstruction of monasteries. Though heavily monitored by Communist Party officials, Tibetans took advantage of the chance to once again publicly embrace their culture.
That was really in the Tibetan religion sort of renaissance period. And my generation, maybe even a little older than me or younger than me, maybe I think that time we had a very little idea about Tibetan Buddhism, what it means, what it's teaching. But certainly we identify with our identity.
Perhaps the most impressive example of the resurgence of religious life occurred at Larangar in Kham, eastern Tibet. Under the guidance of a Buddhist monk and accomplished meditator named Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, Buddhism was undergoing a revival not seen in Tibet since China's occupation. Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok avoided persecution during the Cultural Revolution by taking his Buddhist practice into the isolated mountains of Sertar County. In the early 1980s, he began teaching a handful of monks and nuns in a nearby valley. Over the next 2 decades, he attracted increasing numbers of monks and nuns who built their own one-room adobe huts near his residence. The community became known as the Larangar Buddhist Institute. Because it wasn't registered as a monastery, the monks and nuns hoped that they wouldn't be subject to the burdensome regulations that monasteries came under. It was a spontaneous gathering of monks and nuns around a charismatic teacher. Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok trained thousands in Buddhist philosophy and meditation with his rigorous course of study. And Larangar produced hundreds of qualified teachers who have since helped to regenerate genuine Buddhist practice in many other parts of Tibet. Authorities in Beijing didn't anticipate the resurgence of spiritual activity across the Tibetan plateau in the 1980s and 90s. The government provided little support for religious institutions, and communist leaders believed that the Tibetan people's religious faith would diminish with increased economic and social development in Tibet. Instead, Tibetans resisted Chinese occupation with the expression of their Buddhist identity and devotion to the Dalai Lama. Tibetans continued to rebuild and sustain the monasteries with voluntary donations of money and labor.
Certainly, this is the one way to express Tibetans to say, no, that's not who we are. We have something else, and we identify with the religion, and to saying that we are different from the Chinese, and we feel the difference. And it was quite a proud moment in a lot of Tibetans' life.
This growing expression of religious pride, ethnic identity, and loyalty to the Dalai Lama threatened the Communist Party's vision of national unity. In the mid-90s, authorities in the Tibetan capital Lhasa launched an intensive patriotic education campaign to suppress it. Patriotic education continues in monasteries and lay communities throughout Tibet today. The sessions are often led by Tibetans who have become members of the Chinese Communist Party. In the sessions, they assert that Tibet has always been a part of China, that Tibetans must love the motherland and the Chinese people, and uphold the leadership of the Communist Party.
Some Tibetans fully believe what they're saying because they've been brainwashed by the Chinese. But I believe most Tibetans do it because their livelihoods depend on it.
Tibetans are required to study and often memorize Marxist doctrine, and they are forced to denounce the Dalai Lama, whom China characterizes as a threat to the unity of the motherland and an obstacle to the proper development of Tibet.
When meetings were held, anybody over the age of 18 had to go. And if they said that whole families had to attend, then we had to. We couldn't say we had other work to do.
야나 정권주 미마스숑기 아니 대비 다르체제 지로네 비비 평양의 주발이야 다 도담체고 와르스 나 단다 카데 중로바 용시에 이거는 별랑대 인세 개조게 드라마도 시에요 봐 자와찬에 주소 대자 야우시라요 내도도 용시 말에 얘네 뭐중만 보세요 시라 개점 비도가 너무 저야 나도야 봐 진짜 주소 화야 도담들이야 지부슈야.
In the monasteries, the sessions are designed to identify, expel, or arrest dissident monks and nuns whose Buddhist beliefs or political views conflict with Communist Party principles. The classes can last from 5 days to 3 months. At the end, monks and nuns are forced to sign a document declaring their opposition to the Dalai Lama and professing loyalty to the Communist Party. A refusal to sign can lead to expulsion from the monastery or imprisonment.
Whenever they called us, we had to go no matter what. We didn't have the right to say no. Sometimes they would call us to class during prayer sessions, and we had to go. They would say His Holiness the Dalai Lama was a splitist. They would make us call him bad names and denounce him. That's impossible for us. We'd rather be expelled from the nunnery than denounce the Dalai Lama.
They know that what the Tibetan people really feel about Dalai Lama. They believe that if you can just repeat lies for 1,000 times, and some people will be fooled by it. And they believe in their propaganda because that's the only way they know how to address the issues.
So monasteries were seen as hotbeds of dissident activity and pro-independent sentiment, which in large part was true. Monasteries in some ways are like universities that way. You get a lot of young monks or nuns together, and they're going to talk amongst themselves and take action.
China learned that lesson in the late 80s and early 90s, when the Dalai Lama appealed to the international community to help negotiate a political compromise. Genuine autonomy for Tibetans within China. Beijing's rejection of the Dalai Lama's proposal and criticism of him in the Chinese press sparked a revitalized movement for Tibetan independence in the monasteries of central Tibet. Demonstrations erupted in Lhasa. Brutal reprisals from Chinese military killed scores in Lhasa streets. More than 1,000 monks and nuns were imprisoned and tortured. More than half of Tibet's political prisoners are monks and nuns, some with sentences as long as 18 years. Ani Choying Kunsang spent 4 years in Drapji prison for demonstrating in Lhasa's main bazaar in 1995. She shouted for religious freedom, human rights, and independence. She was charged with endangering state security. When Ani Choying expressed her religious or political beliefs in prison, she was stripped naked, beaten by groups of male guards, and shocked with an electric cattle prod.
They'd use electric batons on our mouths, on our heads, and on the palms of our hands, and beat us with long black rubber pipes. They hit me many times. I had gashes on my head, and my nose bled. I received many punishments like these.
According to the U.S. State Department's annual human rights reports, the torture and abuse of detained monks and nuns occurs routinely in Tibet. In addition to severe beatings, common forms of torture include exposure to extreme heat and cold, hanging by extremities, deprivation of sleep, and electric shock to the genitals.
Even if we are killed after shouting a few words, I still think that it's worth it. If we remained silent, didn't protest in any way, and only listened to the Chinese, then what little religion we can practice in Tibet would disappear altogether.
Increasingly, a lot of the communist cadres realize that this official doctrine of religion withering away isn't really part of human nature and human society. So I think there is a growing realization that religion is here to stay, and China sees it more of a job of just how they manage it so that it doesn't become a threat, it doesn't become a source of power for people to start living and thinking independently.
To monitor compliance with party guidelines, China closely regulates the activities of Tibet's prominent religious figures. The most influential are those believed to be reincarnations of eminent Buddhist teachers from the past. Tibetans regard such reincarnations as holy beings, and while the Dalai Lama is the best-known example of a recognized reincarnation, there are hundreds of others across Tibet.
I think the goal certainly is to try to make sure that the reincarnations that are brought up in Tibet are more obedient to China. They become the leaders in Tibetan society. I think China realizes that they can't get rid of them, so they're going to co-opt them.
In 1992, at the age of 7, Ugyen Tenle Dorje was enthroned as the 17th Karmapa, one of the most important reincarnated figures in Tibetan Buddhism.